What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. With me, as always, is Pastor Leo. We are here to help you take a next step in your relationship with Jesus. We're so glad you're here. Hello and welcome to episode 124 of the Grow Podcast. My name is David. I'm very glad that you're here.
Yes.
Got Leo here. We've got no food today, no Filipino food. So
Kamusta everyone?
You might hear my stomach rumbling. And it's Leo's fault. Just know that it's Leo's fault. Before we even start, just our normal friendly chat, before we dive into Romans, lots of befores today. We have some administrative things to discuss for all of you. So this is the Grow Podcast.
Yes.
Episode 124,
yes.
Which is actually like 126, but we had two episodes that weren't numbered for some unknown reason. Let's not get too deep into it. It's confusing. The original structure of the Grow Podcast was kind of a deeper dive into the sermon from the previous weekend. And then when our previous Pastor Mike, left to be the district superintendent of the Southwest District, and it was before we had Pastor Mark, so we didn't even have an interim at that time.
Right.
So that's when we got Pastor Leo to step up, and we obviously changed the structure because you weren't preaching every week, and sometimes we didn't even know, we weren't even able to record. There was no way those people were going to be able to record a podcast based on their messages every week. So that's when we started the study on Romans, which we're going to finish up chapter 10 of Romans today.
That's right.
However, we would also like to get back to the original format of the Grow Podcast. So in a couple weeks, we're going to start doing that again with Pastor Mark. We also don't want to stop doing this format of the Grow Podcast, which we've been doing, for 20-ish episodes now? Yes. 21 episodes? So we have what we think is a solution. We're going to do both.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do. And if you're like, I can't handle another podcast with David on it, too bad. I'm going to be in both of them. Hopefully that's not the case. But so we're going to turn the Grow Podcast back into what it originally was.
Yes.
And then this study of Romans is going to continue. And then when we're done with Romans, we will then continue on past that. We will have discussions about what we'll study next later.
Yes.
That's a conversation for a later date. But for now, what you need to do, if you want to continue on in the study of Romans, I think both of us would encourage you to listen to both of these podcasts.
That's right.
The purpose is going to be the same for both of them. We want to grow in our relationship with God.
That's right.
The format is going to be a little bit different, but hopefully the function is the same. I think they will both be beneficial. They will just be different from one another. The reason we're switching it to a different podcast is so that it's not hard to find the one you're looking for, right?
That's
if you're
right.
like, okay, I want the next podcast in, I want Romans 13, but you try to go listen to the podcast and it's Pastor Mark on there preaching, talking about what he preached on Sunday, or vice versa. You're a new person at New Hope and you're like, oh, they talked about this podcast where I can hear more about this message that meant a lot to me. And then it's me and Leo talking about Filipino food and weird eggs with chickens or ducks in them that he's trying to make me eat, or who knows what, before we start on Romans. We don't want there to be that kind of confusion. So we're gonna splinter it off and have it as a second podcast. You're still gonna be able to find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on our YouTube channel at New Hope.
Shout out again to the 5 Spotify.
So yeah, that's a very good point. Shout out to the 5 of you on Spotify. There was 6 one week, so I don't know who that person was. Maybe they forgot that they listened somewhere else. Yeah. But most weeks it's 5. But yes, most of you are on those other platforms. We currently, because we're super creative, have a new name for this podcast, at least in the short term, and that is The Show with No Name.
Oh yeah.
Right now there'll be there should be a graphic that comes up right now. There it is. Maybe it's here, or maybe it's here, or maybe it's in front of Leo's face. We'll see how good our editor does with all of that. Yeah, can he make it move? Oh, I'm holding it. He probably can't do any of that. It probably flashed for 2 seconds. We'll see. We'll find out. But The Show with No Name. So here's how this is going to look in practicality. This episode and next week's episode will remain under the Grow Podcast. They will also be posted on The Show with No Name, which you can go find. There's a link to it in here. You can find it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. But we want to make sure you go to that one and subscribe to it now before this study of Romans stops being under the Grow Podcast. Because there's been a ton of you that have been joining us on the Grow Podcast.
Oh, yes.
Grow Podcast for the study on Romans. The engagement in the chat and the community that's building around it is incredible. This is going to help us continue to grow that there while we're able to still have Pastor Mark on the Grow Podcast diving deeper into those messages every single week. So go and find the show with no name. We're very, very creative.
Yes.
I think everybody is blown away right now.
Oh, boy.
With our creativity.
Like, wow. We did not see that
Yeah,
coming.
exactly. They probably didn't, because they probably had higher expectations
That's
for
so
us.
true.
But if you've met me before, you should have expected this. You should know better if this isn't your first episode of the Grow Podcast. So the show with no name, go find that, subscribe to it, stay subscribed to this one, join us at both. The next couple episodes will be on this one, but starting with episode 126, it's going to be Pastor Mark, and you will have to then find us on the other one, on the show with no name. So again, the show with no name, there's a link to it in the podcast notes, in the video notes. Go find it on Spotify, go find it on Apple Podcasts. Check our social media, because we'll share it on there too, on Facebook. So you should be able to find the link on New Hope Here's Facebook as well. So anyway, I think I've said all of the things I need to say. The show with no name. Check it out.
There's a link you can find.
No spoilers. No spoilers. No spoilers. No spoilers.
No spoilers.
Yeah. We have a fun idea that probably you're going to be really annoyed with, and we'll stop doing right away. So that's the show with no name. That's what just to reiterate, that's going to continue to be kind of a deep dive Bible study into Scripture. Not that Pastor Mark doesn't use
not
Scripture
just the book of
when
Romans.
he's preaching, but yeah, we're going to finish Romans. We'll pick a new book, and that we'll continue on. Then the Grow Podcast will go back to its original format. So go find that, go subscribe, jump in the comments, all of that good stuff. Share the link, turn on notifications, all the things that the YouTubers say and the podcasters. Okay, back to the Grow Podcast, episode 124, which is the show with no name, episode 1. And it's very confusing and meta. But for those of you who stopped listening right there and went and found us on the show with no name, welcome to episode 1.
There we go.
Actually, I don't think so. I think we'll leave these non-numbered episodes so that I can actually say the show with no name, episode 1, the first time. I think that'll be a big moment for us.
That'll be great.
Yeah. This is the show with no name, episode -1.
Yes.
Next one will be episode 0. And then we'll have episode 1. All right. That was a lot of nonsense with a little bit of important information mixed in, that could have been the name of the podcast. A lot of nonsense with a little bit of important information mixed in.
Just sift through it.
The just sift through it podcast. Maybe this episode should just be us coming up with names, insulting ourselves on the podcast. No, we're going to get into Romans now. So we're in Romans 10.
Yes.
And we're finishing up Romans 10. So those of you who've been joining us, that's awesome. We just learned today that one of the small groups here at church is going through the book of Romans a small group. And they've been listening to our podcast. I don't know if it's to supplement that or as a part of the study. I'm not sure. First of all, to those of you, I want to say I apologize.
Yeah, we're so sorry.
But also, thank you, and that's why we're doing this. We want you to be able to continue to grow. We want you to be able to have conversations with people about the Word, about what we're learning, about what we're reading together every single week. And we say it a million times, but we grow best when we're in community. And so we have this online community that's been amazing and active in the chat, or not the chat, but the comments. Please keep doing that. That's been super, super cool. If you haven't done that yet, and there's a lot of you that listen that haven't done that, even though we've had so many people in the comments, but we just know that there's a lot of people that haven't jumped in there yet. Jump in and just say hi this week. Maybe you're not ready to give a deep, meaningful answer to one of Leo's questions this week, but just say hello or reply to somebody else's answer and be like, hey, thanks for sharing this, something like that. But let's continue to grow that community and shout out to that small group.
Yes.
Romans 10, verses 14 through 21. If you haven't read them yet, pause, read. Go back and catch up on any episodes you missed. But Leah, why don't you give us kind of the summary that you normally give us on these verses here as we finish up Romans 10.
Okay, so this one is split into 2 parts. The first 4 verses are often used by missionaries and evangelists to show the need for us to take the gospel to the lost. So very famous, especially for those.
There's a lot of famous verses in Romans.
I don't know why.
He just saved all his good stuff for
Right. But although they are specifically referring to the Israelites' rejection, they can refer to anyone. We'll talk about that later. In verses 18 to 21, Paul anticipates another round of argument from his opponents. Again, I don't know why. But yeah, based on what he said, like, did Israel really hear and reject the truth? Maybe they never heard the truth. Maybe if they did, surely they would have rejected it.
And so this is Paul doing his bit. His I again don't know if I should give him credit for like, ooh, he's like using the Socratic method, asking questions to teach, or if he's just trying to make himself feel better by asking questions he already knows the answer to. Both are classics. But again, this is Paul doing the ask and answer himself bit.
Well, and here's something to for us, not just the two of us, but for all of us, especially you guys listening, to think about. For Paul to include these FAQs, his ask
frequently
my own question.
asked questions, asked questions,
questions. What? Anyway,
please continue.
He must have heard them asked by people.
Sure.
Over and over and over again.
He probably isn't coming up with these questions on his own. He has heard them a few times. That's a fair point.
It's in modern days, it's like, I know what you're gonna say, so I'm just gonna answer it right away, kind of thing. So imagine how long Paul would have talked, trying not just to persuade the Jewish Christians and the Gentiles, but also answer their questions and arguments. Like he's gonna sit there and he's gonna talk about something, like maybe salvation, and then people are just gonna start asking questions, or but what about this, or I thought it was like that, and then he'd answer that, and then he'd answer that, and then when he goes to the next church, it's the same thing, and then he goes to the next church, it's the same thing. So he just, okay, I'll just write it down because it's hard to talk. So yeah, the story of and if you know this one, the story of Eutychus, the young man who fell from a third-story window after falling asleep.
That is way more helpful than his name. Because if you were like, remember Eutychus? I'd be like, nah, you just made that up right now. Is that like somebody who attends PH Church? I haven't met them yet. But I of course remember the story of the guy who fell asleep and fell out of the window.
Yep.
Which is a huge bummer to be the one thing you're known for in history.
Right. You're the guy who fell asleep and fell.
Who's more embarrassed by that though? Eutychus or Paul, whose sermon
true.
Was clearly not the most interesting thing ever on this particular day.
No, but it does make sense, and that's the thing. His story of him falling asleep and falling, literally.
Poor guy.
Right, I know, right? During one of Paul's preachings, and if you want to find this, his story is found in Acts chapter 20. It makes more sense because it says there it lasted until midnight, but why would it last until midnight? Because Paul was leaving the next day. But still, why would it last until midnight just because Paul was leaving? He's not like, he's not self-centered. It's like, I'm leaving, so you better listen.
Sure, he probably had a lot of things to answer, a lot of those questions.
He wanted to address all of those arguments. Yeah. So it's taken us 20 episodes already. Think about it, right? We're just more than halfway through. We're not even done. So just the fact, think about it. If it's like half an hour per episode, let's say, minus all of the rabbit trails.
So like 5 minutes per episode.
Right. So it's how long? Even if it's just, let's say 10 minutes. That's still like a long time.
Leo doesn't want to do math right now.
I don't want to do math.
Over 3 hours.
It's the day after Halloween.
We've probably put in about 5-ish hours of deep dive into this so far.
That's right.
In our podcast, yeah.
So think about it, 5 hours. If that was Paul, he would have started like 7 o'clock in the evening. So
yeah,
it just makes sense.
Let's jump into those. You mentioned the first 4 verses. And they are really, really famous verses.
Yes.
Like for most people who grew up consistently going to church, you've heard these before, and they are very common about missionary or evangelist using these verses to. Like I remember being at youth events and they're doing like the, if God's calling you to be a missionary, come forward. And they would always read those verses,
Yes.
And but you said that they were referring to the Israelites' rejection of the gospel. But then you also said they can just refer to anyone. So my question is both about these verses, but also a lot of what we've talked about. We even had a comment a couple episodes ago, like, who liked the analogy we had about like how, like those of us who kind of grew up in the faith are like, we match very closely to the Jews in this instance, based on what we're talking about. I think it was episode 120, 121. Anyway, how do we know that we're not taking things out of context, applying that to ourselves? Because like you said, like Paul is specifically referring to the Israelites' rejection, the rejection of the Jewish people in this instance. So when we apply that to ourselves, how do we know, like, that's okay, that I'm not taking things out of context, and that is, how we're supposed to be reading this?
Well, Paul quotes Joel chapter 2, verse 32 to show that the gospel is, in fact, for everyone. It says there, whoever calls in the name of the Lord shall be saved. Whoever means whoever.
This is a really good breakdown of the word whoever.
Whoever means whoever. Like, it doesn't matter if you're an Israelite, if you're a Jewish person, if you're a Roman Catholic, or if you're an Adventist, or if you're a Christian, a Baptist, a Presbyterian,
an alien.
We
won't dive into that. That's a comment. Well, I'll ask that when Pastor Mark takes over the Grow podcast. I'll ask him if aliens can go to heaven, and we'll see.
I'd love to hear his answer to that one. But okay. Anyway, all right. So whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Whoever means all of us. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. If that's the case, then what is the use of the gospel if nobody hears about it? I mean, think about it, right? What's the use of the gospel if nobody hears about it? It's true. So Paul asks a series of hows. He starts with, how shall they call? And then, how shall they believe? And then, how shall they hear without a preacher? To show the steps to salvation. In order for us to better understand that, let's reverse the order, answering his question from the very end, going back to the first one that he asked. First, God sends out his servants. Servants meaning all of us, not just the pastors, not just the preachers, not just the evangelists, all of us. God sends out his servants. His servants, us, tell people the good news of salvation. That's why it's important for all of us to talk to people about Jesus. So these people hear God's offer of life in Jesus. And then some of those, not all, unfortunately, sadly, that's the truth, some of those who hear believe the message. And then those who believe call on the Lord, and then the last one is those who call on him are saved. Again, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So whoever call on him is saved. So notice, there are no religious beliefs and practices. You don't have to follow a certain tradition or a certain practice just because the other guys are doing it. Whoever calls on him are saved. In other words, if God wills the end, he also wills the means for us to reach that end and for his plans to reach that end. So Paul is explaining why he's preaching the gospel to the non-Jewish Gentiles.
Okay, but then I go down and I read verse 17. Excuse me. And I'm going to read it quick out of the ESV. So faith comes from hearing.
Yes.
And hearing through the word of Christ. So
yes.
You said before that, like, okay, we need to share the good news. Verse 17 seems to be implying that just hearing it creates faith.
Right.
So should we not just have like all the windows to the church open on Sunday and just like blast the volume as loud as we possibly can so anybody who drives by like gets faith by proxy, just like it like hits their car as they're driving by or whatever. It's winter here. I was going to say walking by, but no, there's nobody walking by the church right now in Wilson, North Dakota. But yeah, like that verse seems to say, faith comes from hearing and salvation comes from faith. So people just got to hear it. So, but how do I then accept that verse when there's plenty of people I know that have heard the good news and have not been saved.
Right. Well, hearing is not enough. A person must hear, but he needs to also have an open heart and an open mind. Mm-hmm. If you have an open heart and an open mind, and then you hear the word, and then you hear the gospel, then they will be open to the truth of God. So they need to be open to the truth of God. So when they hear it and when they listen to it, and remember, that's when we go back to the story of Pharaoh and Paul, because Paul used Pharaoh as an example. Like, even if God intervened 9,999 times, if he's not open, nothing's gonna happen.
Right.
Paul, though, was open, so when he heard the gospel, he believed. So hearing the word about Jesus does not necessarily have to involve the ears. It's the message might be read, like if you're reading it, or if you're watching it, if you're listening to it on Spotify.
I already forgot the name of on the show with no name.
On the show with no
check
name.
my notes there. Go subscribe now.
Right? So it's you don't have to necessarily involve the ears. You can read it, you see it in a movie, a TV show, a stage play, whatever, as long as you are able to, quote unquote, hear the gospel, the good news that Jesus offers. So to hear means to receive the word by whatever means necessary. So you don't have to be a good speaker just so you can spread the Bible or the good news. You don't have to be eloquent enough. Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Yeah.
That was very eloquent. Let's go to verse 18, which is, so now we're getting to that second half of this group of verses that you were talking about. You said earlier that Israel heard and rejected, right?
Yes.
So that, again, that you had kind of answered that earlier, but I wanted a more in-depth answer on the hearing bit. But so is that really what's going on here? When I read verse 18, that this group of verses gets confusing just in a quick read now, because he starts to. This is something that trips me up even to this day, but especially when I was younger, and it was just like, I'm just reading, and anytime I got to the parts in the New Testament, especially with Paul, when he starts like back to back to back quoting Old Testament scripture, it's not my natural instinct to like stop while I'm reading and be like, okay, like how does, what was the context of this Old Testament scripture that he's quoting that they all would have known, and what's the message he's trying to say to them? I just go like, oh my goodness, okay, Moses said some stuff, and then Isaiah said some other stuff, and then okay, let's move on to chapter 11, and hopefully he'll stop quoting old scripture.
That's so true. That is so true.
Yeah, and for real, and I think that's like, thankfully at this point in my life, I catch myself most of the time when I'm doing that, which I did as I was preparing for, no joke, not just the first time. The second time I read through these verses yesterday, I was reading through for the second time, getting ready to record today. And I got through all those verses, and I was just like, moving on. I was like, no, I have to talk about these verses. I can't just move on and not think about them.
That's so true.
So is this really what Paul's saying here, especially as he's quoting all this old scripture? Is this really what Israel did? Did they really hear and reject the truth of the gospel?
Yes. No, I'm just kidding.
All right. So moving on, I have another question.
All right. So Paul answers this.
You can get more gold like that on the show with no name starting in a couple weeks. Go find it and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
All right, spread the word.
Here's the logo. Let's see if he gets that one. All right, please answer. No.
That's so awesome. All right, so Paul answers this argument in verse 18 by showing that God's words had gone out not only to Israel, but to all the world. This is true, especially nowadays, which is true, right? This podcast, in fact, is one of the proofs of it. The rise of the internet, especially social media, it has given us a great opportunity to reach out to people.
Sure.
We reach out to friends, to families, to neighbors, former classmates, co-workers, what have you. It doesn't matter. Like even people on the other side of the world. Shout out to all the Filipinos who are in the U.S. So the question is, do we Christians capitalize on this opportunity that people like Paul himself never had? I mean, imagine the impact Paul would have had if he had at least something like an email. Right?
Well, I don't know. It's super easy to send stuff to your junk mail folder these days.
That is so true. Though.
Like sometimes you're just like, Paul, you're just go
it's
into
like
the
from
junk
Paul
folder.
again. And it's like,
he keeps emailing me
he
about
keeps-
stuff Isaiah said.
and he keeps asking himself the same questions. Like, but yeah, it's this is something even Paul himself never had. There are reels about Jesus. There are videos about Jesus. There are TV shows about Jesus. There are articles about Jesus. There are songs about Jesus.
Someone should do a podcast about it. Maybe 2 different podcasts. Like the show with no name. You can go subscribe. I'll stop, I promise.
Okay. So do we share what really matters to the people that really matter to us, or do we just keep scrolling?
It's interesting that you talk about the things we have that Paul didn't have, but like Paul used the new technologies that they had and the new advances of the time that they had in a to the best of his ability, right? Like there had never been an easier time to travel in what they considered the known world at that time, right? Like the Roman Empire had made it so easy to travel, again, not compared to how easy it is now. But take like 500 years before Paul's time, like it would have been a nightmare to try to go to all these different places where he was going. You wouldn't even have to go 500 years. So he used the technology and the advancements of civilization that he had, and that, like, I think it's interesting that you bring that up. Like we have all of these tools as well. Yeah. How are we using them, or are we using them properly?
That's exactly the point, because these verses show the need to both hear and believe. Not just for them, but for all of us. We cannot make someone believe. You can't. But we can let them hear. And that's the necessary first step before believing. How can they believe what they don't hear in the first place, right? So if we care for someone, we should pray for them, make sure that they hear. We should give as many people as we can the opportunity to hear and respond. Do they all believe? No, of course not. But in fact, many don't. But the fact that we spread the good news is us doing our own work for the kingdom.
Yeah. So what about those who don't believe? Boy, I think we might scrap that other podcast, actually. Go unsubscribe to the show with no name on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.
All right, so in verses 19, Paul shows us the way back in the Old Testament. This rejection by the people of Israel was prophesied by God.
Sure.
It didn't catch him by surprise.
Yeah, he really cherry picks some like rough verses or pieces of scripture to pull into his letter here for the nation of Israel.
The roughest words for his own people.
This isn't like a super fun time to be one of the Jewish people reading this letter.
It's not a love letter for the people.
No, if you were one of the Jewish Christians, this wasn't your favorite part of the letter.
That is specific so true. So yeah, God's plan has been to use the Gentiles as an example to the Jews. In the same way that he wanted the Jews to be an example to the Gentiles.
That's cool.
It's cool, right? Yeah. It's the way he uses one another to be an example for one another kind of thing.
Yeah, especially with what we just read, it was a couple episodes ago where, Paul was saying like there's no difference between us now because of Jesus. And because of that, of course we can be good examples for one another, right? Like you look at the Old Testament, and usually when God was using the Gentiles as an example for the Jewish people at the time, for the Israelites, it was a negative example. It was look at what will happen. Like, look at the mess over there. Like, that's going to be you if, you're not following me.
Right.
Whereas now, as Paul said, like there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. Because of Christ, now we can be positive examples for one another, which as a non-Jewish person, I'm pretty pumped about.
That is so cool.
But I think, too, another interesting thing, if we go into verse, give me a second here, Leo, 19, we get the jealousy line. And so this is one that comes up sometimes. Now, in this specific instance, this isn't like the God is a jealous God, but we hear. I
Right.
feel like we hear that all the time. God is a jealous God, and
right.
it's like that doesn't sound like a good thing. We grow up and jealousy is a bad thing. Like
Yeah.
we're not supposed to be jealous. We shouldn't covet things. And when he's quoting Moses in verse 19, he says, "I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation." Like,
Right.
so is God forcing us to sin now? Then, like, and is he sinful himself because he's that's just an interesting one. So
yeah, I've heard that before.
we break that one down for us a little bit
Yep.
here.
Okay, so jealousy or envy, some translations use envy itself. It's not necessarily bad. It's not a bad thing. Not necessarily. God himself was jealous when Israel was worshiping other gods, which is one of the things that people use. It's like he's jealous. That's not a good thing. But here's the thing. If a husband sees his wife with another man and becomes jealous, it's not evil, right? Jealousy and envy becomes evil when it's misguided and misplaced. When we have no right to something or we have no right to someone, but we still want it or them for ourselves, then it becomes really, really bad. In this case, God uses us, the Gentiles, to show Israel the blessings he has for us, for the people who are not Israelites, and encourage them to repent so that they can be his people again. Paul further emphasizes this in verses 20 to 21 when he quotes Isaiah. Isaiah says that God was found by the Gentiles who weren't, and here's the thing, they weren't even actually looking for, inquiring about him. The Gentiles didn't seek after God. They were satisfied with their pagan religions. But many of them did respond when they heard about the gospel. When they heard the truth, they responded. So relatively speaking, Gentiles responded more than the Jews.
And before all of the Gentiles out there get real high and mighty about how well we responded, like Leo just said, the Gentiles were, like you said, they weren't looking for him. That's what Isaiah said. I've been found by those who did not seek me. They weren't looking
That's
for
so
him.
true.
I've shown myself to those who did not ask for me. That's what it took for it to go to everybody, right?
Yes.
But that's also the it's almost like the pain for God of like these were supposed to be my people.
Right.
Not supposed to be. These were my people. Like I chose them. They were my people, and they didn't respond. Like that sucks.
Yeah.
For lack of a better, a more intelligent way of saying it. Like that sucks. That hurts. And I think this would have hurt similarly to be a Jewish person reading that. And again, to use the analogy I've used in the past, like when I read this as a person who grew up in the church, who has known God my whole life, like I see myself more as the Israelites, the Jewish people when I'm reading this, right? Like yes, I like by blood I am a Gentile. I don't have a Jewish background, but when I'm learning from this, kind of like we talked about earlier, right? Like, are we taking things out of context when we see ourselves on one or another side of this? We're definitely not, because that's way more in line with who I am. I've known God my whole life. I've never like had to have a big reveal of who he was to me. He's been a part of my life forever. I was introduced to him, since before I can remember. That's the side that I, identify with in this, and that speaks to me. So that, if I'm rejecting him, then I fall on that side of things where you get to verse 21, like you were saying, but of Israel, he says, all day long I've held up my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. And when I'm straying from God, like that's where I fall. I don't fall in I didn't even know who he was. He needed to show himself to me. I fall in I know who he was, and I still rejected him, and I still strayed away from him. And so,
well, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who will say who will describe themselves as religious, but in their heart they are not really seeking after.
It's more of a cultural thing than a relationship. Yeah.
So, which brings us to our main point for chapter 10. When we realize what's at stake for those who do not hear or those who do not receive the gospel, we should be compelled to share it at all costs.
Even if I'm not a missionary?
Even if you're not a missionary. Unfortunately.
What?
It's for us.
Why do you think?
All of us.
Why do you think those, like, sometimes it's really easy for us to write those things off, though? Like, you weren't a pastor until a few years ago, so
Yep.
you used to be one of us.
Yep.
One of us non-pastors out there, non-missionaries. Why, like, sometimes it's really easy to just be like, man, those people do really need Jesus. I hope they go listen to Pastor Mark on Sunday, and he'll tell them all about him. When very clearly, like, again, we started in verse 14 and that group of verses, when he's talking about, like, how can they believe if they don't hear, and how do they hear if no one goes? It doesn't say, it doesn't, like, then specify, and, like, 1% of you will be sent as missionaries, and those are the ones. Like, it's clearly talking to all of us.
That's right.
But we push that responsibility off onto others. Why do you think that is? And why is it so easy sometimes for us to do?
Well, we talked about this a few episodes back. It's like we're putting ourselves, or we're putting those other people in harm's way.
Sure,
Behind their back.
We hide behind them.
Right? It's like, ooh, I'm going to block myself with this guy.
Yeah.
Right? So it's...
I like that idea.
And plus,
Sure.
We have to remember, we don't have to be great speakers
Yep.
just to spread the gospel.
I mean, Paul's quoting Moses here,
Right.
who, like, notoriously was a terrible speaker. Like, that was his excuse.
It's in the Bible, too.
Yeah, I'm not making that up. Like,
Right.
we don't have audio, so I guess I can't. I didn't hear it, but, like,
Right.
it's in Scripture. Like, he was a bad speaker. He was like, I can't do this. You got to have Aaron come with me to talk for me, basically. And but again. So, I mean, if it was good enough for Moses, why can't I use the same excuse he used?
That is so true.
But
is so true.
He's this person that wasn't this great speaker, and yet here he is being quoted by Paul, whatever, 1,000 some
Right.
years later, and then we're reading it 2,000 years after that.
Yep.
And so it's certainly for all of us, but man, sometimes it's really easy to, like you said, like, well, that's Leo's job. Like, Leo's the pastor at PH Church. Yeah, I can hide behind. I can. I might draw the line at inviting someone, which
Right.
again is an amazing thing. Like, inviting someone to come to church to hear the good news is awesome.
It is.
But it doesn't mean that you'll never have the responsibility of, like, actually sharing the good news yourself.
right.
And there's plenty of people that won't ever step foot in a church.
There's a difference between inviting and sharing.
Yeah. But I'm trying to remember the exact stat, but I think it's something like there's 45% of people in the United States will never step foot into
Right.
a church, no matter what the reason is. But so, like, for those, are those people just out of luck then? Like, I invited them, they didn't come. Like, my job's done.
Yeah.
But or could I find a way to share that good news with
They
them?
don't have to go inside a church building.
Are you sure? Is that in here somewhere? I didn't read. Yeah. Well, do you have a head change, heart change, life change for us here before
Yes,
we wrap
I
up,
do.
Pastor Leo?
So here's
Because
the
we're
head
at the end of
change.
Romans 10.
So here's your head change. Know that God has appointed all of us. I'm going to say that slowly. All of us to spread the good news of the gospel to those who haven't heard it.
Mm-hmm.
Heart change is this. Feel compassion. Feel
Yeah.
compassion for those who have not heard or received the gospel.
Some empathy is
Yep.
good. Yep.
It is. And here's your life change. Life change is this. Take the gospel to people who've never heard it, here and around the world. Again, you don't even have to step out of your house anymore to do that. All you
Yep.
need to do is fish out your phone
Yep.
and start sharing.
Yep.
So, yeah. Okay. So here are your questions for this episode. Number 1, in what ways have you carried forward the message of Jesus now that you have received the gospel? Here's your second one. How do you respond when people reject the message you share with them? How do you respond when people reject
I
you?
get furious and I scream at them that they're
Yep.
going to burn for all eternity. Is that the right move?
Oh, yeah.
Please hear the sarcasm in Pastor Leo's voice.
So what?
That's a really good question,
Yeah.
though, and some people might not be comfortable answering that one, and some people might think that they need to have, like, a super holy sounding answer. But I think that's a good one for us to talk about in the comments, because that's tough. Like, this is the
It is.
most important thing in my life, and I share it with you, and you reject it, and that hurts.
Right.
And my instinct when I'm being hurt is to hurt the person that hurt me. People say all the time, hurt people hurt people. Like,
Yes.
so I try to share this thing, and you hurt me. It's hard to not like attack back.
And the fear of rejection is a very real thing.
For real. Yeah. And so I think that's a really good one. You have a second part to that question too.
Yep. So how do you respond when people reject the message you share with them? And the second part is, what do you do to maintain your motivation to continue sharing the good news? Because this might be helpful for a lot of people
Absolutely.
out there.
Yep.
So yeah, because they rejected me. I've been rejected for like 100 times already. I don't want to do this anymore. But I read your message. I read your comment. It encouraged me. So it might help. So here's the third one. What can you do this week?
That's too quick.
To get the message of the gospel to those of you who've yet to receive it. Right? And then remind yourself to ask yourself this question every week.
Do I have to ask that question, and then when I answer it, do I then have to follow through with the answer? Or can I just have the head knowledge of like, oh, this is what I could do this week?
Head knowledge is good enough. Again, listen to the sarcasm in my voice.
Yeah. Think of what you could do this week and then follow through with it.
Follow
through with it. Find a way to, and again, it doesn't need to be, I'm going to find the first person who doesn't know Jesus I see and scream at them about how they're going to hell until they accept Jesus. That's probably not a great first step, to be honest. But
a great first step.
But yeah, let's think about that and then actually follow through with it. And then come back next week for the last ever Grow podcast episode in this Romans study, because we'll be moving to the show with no name.
Yay.
Go and find that. The link is in the podcast notes or the video description, and subscribe to that, because next week we'll be starting Romans 11. We're doing verses 1 through 10.
That's right.
Even though in your notes we're doing verses 11 through 10, which is mathematically complicated. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do verses 1 through 10.
Right, 1 through 10.
Verses 1 through 10. And so read those, come back next week. And again, go find that new podcast and subscribe. I know I've jokingly brought it up about 17 times during the podcast, but I'm doing that because I don't want 2 weeks from now, when the Grow podcast is Pastor Mark, and you're like, we didn't finish Romans.
Right.
What happens in the last few chapters of Romans? I want you to still be with us for that. So go find the podcast with no name. Again, you should be able to find it on our Facebook page, the New Hope Here Facebook page. There's a link in the video or the podcast notes. You hopefully would be able to search for it, New Hope Here, and then the podcast the show with no name, and hopefully you can find it. And once again, here's the image for it. I have no idea if our editor will do any of that. And
good luck.
For those of you only listening to the audio, you have no idea why there was silence right there. But no, we love you so much, New Hope family and Grow Podcast family. It's been so awesome studying Romans with you. It's been really, really cool hearing stories about how this podcast has helped you. It's been amazing seeing you guys connect with each other in the comments. This week, again, if you haven't done that yet, just jump in and say hello. Maybe you're not ready to give an answer yet, but just say hello in the comments. Let's get even more of us connecting and building that community. And then for those of you who are commenting every single week, keep doing that, and then come back a couple days later and respond to somebody else's comment. Read what the other people are saying. Give them a little like in there or whatever, and then respond to it. So again, we can continue to grow in community. We grow best when we're in community. That's how God designed us. So let's continue to grow this community we're so thankful for. Thank you, Pastor Leo. Thanks to all of you. If you haven't subscribed to the Grow Podcast yet, do that as well, because the Grow Podcast will continue on, like we said, in its original format. I'm done with all of that stuff now. So I will just end with, we love you, and we will see you next time.
Ingat.